Hey, we're live. It's Brent Leary. 2 weeks in a row doing a few good minutes. It's great. I'm on a roll. I feel good about that. Uh, Nice day here in Atlanta. It's about, I don't know, 95 degrees or so. But it's always cool to be able to spend a few good minutes with my next guest, particularly when we're going to be talking about, well, what everybody else is talking about. You can't really get away from generative AI, LLMs, and all these things. Of course, with what OpenAI did with ChatGPT about, I don't know, 8 or 9 months ago, the world has changed, right? And that means the world of enterprise tech has changed. But how has it changed? And is it changed in a way that we're all ready for? That's why I have my buddy Ron Miller join me from TechCrunch, all the way from one of my favorite cities in the whole world, or the Boston metro area.
That's right. I'm actually 2 hours west of Boston, but I know how much you love it up here.
You know what? I don't dislike Boston. Maybe some of the things around the
Maybe
city,
Foxborough.
but hey, man, thanks for taking time to join me.
Pleasure.
We've known each other for, it seems like, forever at this point.
It's been a long time.
Has been. And as long as I've known you, you've always been covering, enterprise tech. And I've always been around the CRM and now the CX space, and I guess everything else that's kind of tied into that now. But I think since November of last year, have you ever seen a time in your, years of covering tech? Have you ever seen a time like this where one thing is just kind of engulfed everything?
Well, I mean, I think, tech tends to do that, and I think we tend to forget that. But, there's always something that I'm covering. But I'll tell you, from like December to April, it was all Salesforce and their activist investors, and then that kind of took a back burner. And at that point, I started paying attention to generative AI, and I kind of resisted it at first. I'm going to be honest, because I felt like maybe it was the next, Web3 metaverse kind of stuff. And we had so much hype on that last year, and I mean, who knows? Sometimes things take a while to bake, but nothing came of all the hype. So I resisted it a little bit this time, but it was just impossible not to pay attention to this. And really, since the end of March, it's like completely taken over my coverage. And I mean, just in the last week, I think I was looking at the stories I wrote. And this morning, I mean, I wrote about Ignite, and they just made their generative AI announcement. And I wrote about a company called Graft, which is a platform for companies to build their own AI applications on top of. And that kind of part of the business is kind of taking a backseat. For a long time. AI was about machine learning and having these kinds of little nuanced tools or platforms to build
Yeah.
from machine learning models. And then all of a sudden it changed in a dime. And you're right, it was in November, early December, when OpenAI released ChatGPT. And the difference with that is that, I think, is because it puts AI like in front of you in a way that AI in the past didn't. So the way I describe it is this: if you were using Salesforce over the last 4 or 5 years and you asked for a report on the customers most likely to churn, you would get it, but you wouldn't say, "Oh my God, AI just gave me a report of the customers most likely to churn." Some people knew, I'm sure, but most people were just like, "The software did its job for me. Thanks very much." And it wasn't like this obvious thing that Einstein was under the hood doing this. And now, because you can watch it in real time, give you an answer, it's a very different dynamic.
Is it? I mean, because yeah, you're right. I was reading something. I think Einstein was, and this is kind of a dated article I read, but it was saying, I think at the end of 2022, it was saying Einstein was doing 80 billion predictions a day. I mean, that's a lot. I mean, it has absolutely nothing to do with this stuff that got everybody's attention. But that's AI's been around forever and
Right.
doing
I mean,
helpful.
it's been around for decades. I mean, but
Yeah.
and over the last decade, it's really coming to its own. But again, mostly in the background, helping, you know, produce certain things, whether it's reports or, like configuring infrastructure or, you know, the kinds of like nitty gritty plumbing things that doesn't excite anybody, right?
Right. But being able to say a few words and make pretty pictures, or have it write your school paper, it's caught everybody's attention, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the consumer side and there's the enterprise side, right? And I think, yes, and that's the kind of the purpose of this discussion. Yes, everybody's on the bandwagon, but I think everybody's just at the beginning, and we don't know where this is going to go or what impact this is going to have. But it seems like, to a very large extent, it could change the way we think about software, the way we build software, and the way we interact with software.
You know what? One of the things that came out, I guess there was two earnings calls last night from
Yeah,
the big guys, Microsoft and
and
Google.
Google.
So I was really curious to see, what both of them had to say. So I was checking out the transcripts of some of these calls, and let me pop this up. This is a couple of bullet points from the Microsoft one. And I like this because I actually did a search on the word Copilot just to see how many times it was referenced. You want to take a guess as to how many times it was
I
referenced?
don't know. I have millions, though, probably.
Well, I thought not quite that much, but
Right.
it was referenced at least 48 different times, and
Oh, you
just
mean in the
in the
document, not in Google?
oh no, and just in
Yeah.
the call
Well,
for the
yeah.
yeah
Yeah. They're pushing that for
yeah,
sure. But
but
what was interesting is that I'm sorry to interrupt, but what was interesting was their revenue was only up single digits, like 7 or 8%, right? And so whatever this is, it's not generating money yet, right?
no.
And my buddy Alex Wilhelm, on the TechCrunch Plus side of the house this morning, wrote an interesting piece that said, they're investing billions in this stuff. It's taking a lot off the cost of doing business right now, and that with the gamble, the bet that this is going to be something that generates a ton of revenue, down the road.
Yeah, and some of the things that, because there was some flowery kind of language in some of these transcripts, and a little bit more on the Google side. But I will say there were some data points that did come out of the Microsoft call, and here's a couple. More than I like this. More than 63,000 organizations have used AI powered capabilities in the Power Platform, up 75% quarter over quarter. I like when they give you not just a percentage, but they actually give you an actual number so you can figure out, well, that's how significant that is. But when you think, you kind of couple the increase quarter over quarter with that number, it seems like this thing is looking like it could take off. At least looking at some of these data points.
Well, I mean, to the extent that these data points are truly saying what they're saying, because again, I saw some sort of survey or something along the way that was talking about you know people using AI, and again, going back to that example of the customers most likely to churn, you were using AI and you didn't know it. So for the last 5 to 10 years, people have been using AI, and if you ask them if they were using AI, they would say no, right? So, you know,
Yeah.
are they using net new AI? I mean, are they just realizing that AI is powering what they're doing because it's being made more available, and everything is being rebranded Copilot, right? So, that it's, I mean, I'm sure that there's an increase. I don't know exactly how much it is. That's how I would put it.
Do you think that all this, the kind of the stuff that's catching everybody's attention, the generative AI stuff, everybody's talking about that, and ChatGPT and all that, is it finally bringing like new life and interest to like old school AI, like things that actually could potentially have more immediate impact, like using this to come up with next best actions, or to have a better idea of this behavior based on this data could lead to this particular predictable outcome?
So, I mean, the whole point of all of this is eventually to get us to the point where the AI can act as a trusted assistant, right? And we're not anywhere close to that. We are kind of a fancy NLP search, that I mean, putting aside the code and putting aside the ability to generate drawings, and that's a whole different category. But if you're talking about generating text and being able to do things right now, you have to kind of explicitly ask what it is that you want to do. So it's still the human kind of leading the way for the intelligence. And some would argue that it isn't even really artificial intelligence in the pure sense. It's one of my colleagues called it a glorified Mad Lib, a digital Mad Lib, but because it is basically a probability engine, right? It's saying like, what is the next best word? So until it becomes something that can really help you, uh, make better decisions and do your job better, and kind of do like a digital administrative assistant would do, like begins to understand your behaviors and like what hotels you like and what airline you like, and um, you know what how you would tend to react to this and that, and prioritize it for you. I mean, right now it's got a lot of potential, but within a narrow scope. Over time, it's probably going to get better. But I think to put the brakes on a little bit, you have to kind of keep in mind, and I want to kind of set this with the fact that I am not by any means an AI expert. I've talked to a bunch of people who know this stuff, but I am not, somebody who understands, the computer science of it. And I want to make that clear. But I have talked about it a lot with a lot of smart people, and I've written about it. But that doesn't make me an expert. But I think, when AI can do one thing, it's easy to think that because we've created this AI that can do this one thing, that, oh my God, it can do everything.
Right.
And to get to each incremental gain in AI is a very difficult thing to do. And, I remember talking to Rodney Brooks, who's the guy who, created the Roomba, and he's like a robotics and AI guru, a few years ago. And he said, because AI can do this one thing, like people naturally say, like, oh, it's as smart as my nephew, is how he put it, and it's not. It can do that one thing and it can't do anything else, basically.
Right.
It can do one thing, it can do it well, it can do it better than us because it can do it really fast. But it doesn't mean that it can think, it can be creative. And even this stuff, I mean, it needs a body of work to create another body of work. And sure, you can say that's art, like we all kind of borrow from each other. But there's like a certain human element that, if you stopped creating new stuff, I think you would end up with some pretty boring derivative crap. So humans have to continually be feeding the beast, right? Or you're just going to kind of have the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
So that, and the fact that just because it can do this thing today doesn't mean like it's going to take over the world and we're all not going to be working tomorrow.
Let me play a little short clip. Because what you just said reminded me of something that was said yesterday on my buddy Esteban Kolsky show. He had John Reed, another big time Boston sports fan. How do I end up with all these friends?
John lives down the street, by the way.
It figures. Now, well, let me play what he said about, because it kind of crystallized a point you just made about the human aspect, and the ability to is not quite there for this stuff to do what folks like you and I do. Check this out.
A board level meeting, those are almost always a half an hour, and a good chunk of that meeting is usually listening to the board member. Usually I will have 5 or 10 minutes at the end to say my piece. My job is to distill everything I've seen and give them 1, 2, or 3 key points about the market that I think are most impactful to them. That's what they want, very highly curated. A machine at this point in time could never provide them with that, but it could feed into the content that I would consume and organize to make that, for sure. I will also have the audacity to tell them what I think they should do with that information.
What do you think?
I mean, I think it's, he puts it as, working as a consultant, but I mean, the same thing applies to my job, right? I mean, you can take, a box score or an earnings report and create a story. And we've been able to do that, since 2014 or 15. And I don't think ChatGPT changes that. But, what AI can't do is it can't talk to people. It can't, it can't come up with a thesis and then talk to a bunch of people and try and figure out, is that true? And is this what's happening in the market and all of that? And, I think it's tempting, though, for a lot of companies to look at this technology and see what it can do. And it's a little bit dazzling when you look at it, and think, okay, well, this can just replace a human today. And yeah, it can, but it's not going to be very good. And I think a lot of companies that are doing this are kind of going to be in for a rude awakening once they create a lot of, generic crappy content.
Does it feel like that's the silver bullet? Once again, throughout time immemorial, people have always tried to search for a silver bullet for everything that ails them. Like, this is the thing that will solve it, and we can put all our hope into this thing, and once we get it, we're done. We don't have to worry about it. It feels like, once again, that's what kind of the customers are asking, is this it finally? And it also feels like the enterprise is not being quick enough to say it's not that, but it can be very helpful.
Right. I mean, it's good. It's probably going to be helpful, right?
Yeah.
It's probably going to speed up a lot of people's work. I mean, it's going to take a lot of the mundane tasks that a lot of us do. And I'll give you an example. I wrote about this company called Writer, which is a generative AI writing startup. And they were telling me about a customer that they have was a Accenture, and they have like these. I mean, they have hundreds of thousands of employees, and they have these quarterly reports that they have to write, and they never catch up with them, right? Because there's so many people and there's so much information that needs to be distilled in a company that large, that having a digital assistant that can help you create this stuff quickly and efficiently, is going to be like a big, change agent for them. And, it's a matter of finding, something that can do things like that humans don't like doing, and making that a much easier task, or reducing the amount of time it takes to do a coding task, because a lot of the stuff that's repetitive and mundane can be done by the machine. But again, like, there's got to be a human involved here, and and I think there will be for the foreseeable future. And I mean, some of that, I suppose, is wishful thinking on my part, but I also think that we're not quite where people think we are. I mean, people tend to overestimate and underestimate this stuff, right?
Yeah.
But I think they kind of overestimate just how much it can take over in its current state. And, everybody's like kind of jumping on the bandwagon and trying to see what they can do with it. And I do think that companies have to be paying attention to this. And I think it'd be both from a software perspective and from a customer perspective. And it would be foolish not to. But, I don't think you can just sort of say that this is going to be like this is going to end a lot of the work that we have to do, because there's always going to be some work that only we can do. And the AI is not, nearly, smart enough yet to be able to do that. And I mean, maybe we can talk about, some of the fear mongering that we're hearing. Well, people are talking about it taking over the world.
Right.
But I mean, I kind of look at it more like Star Trek, right? In Star Trek, the humans interact with the computer in a very, interactive way. And the computer gives them information. But ultimately, it's it's Kirk and Spock who are making the decisions. The
Right.
computer doesn't take over the ship
Right.
unless they tell it to. And so, I think that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think one of the really smart branding moves that particular Microsoft did was calling it Copilot. It's something that's easily understood,
Right.
and the connotation is it's not here to take over.
Right.
It's here to
It's here to
actually
help.
assist you.
Yeah.
And so the early part of conference season, when I think companies were really trying to play catch up to all the excitement that ChatGPT brought and all the interest that it brought, to all this stuff. The earlier conferences were more like, I'm not going to be specific about any particular one, but it felt like they were more like cheerleading sessions for saying, we've got Gen AI. Hey, we got it. We're good. Ours is the best. That's how it started out. But towards the end of the spring conference season, I really felt like there were some examples of companies that were talking about it in a much more strategic way and positioning in a much more strategic way. An example would be Verint, who they're all in on the kind of the CCaaS stuff, contact center as a service, and they positioned this stuff kind of as kind of infusing their bot strategy with Gen AI and for particular use cases. So one of the things that they talked about, and it made a ton of sense, is agents do not like to write summary reports after the call. It's like, man, we just got done with this call. We got to get back on. I don't want to have to do a write-up. So they talk about how they're infusing AI into their bots to be able to create these after call summaries for agents. That's a complete win-win, because agents don't have to write a summary. They can look at it, approve it, tweak it, but they don't have to spend time writing it. That is a great example of how you can integrate this stuff in and have a sudden impact as you could have on an actual employee, which there's like win-win-wins all the way around, because then you can see how accurate it is. They approve it, that gets fed back into the the data feeding stuff, and then hopefully that will be used to create better next best actions, recommendations, predictions, what have you. So are you seeing more deeper, more thoughtful kind of placement of Gen AI from enterprise vendors now that they might have had a chance to catch their breath and then really think about this, as opposed to all the reaction stuff about, yeah, we got it, we're good, we got it. Well, what is it? Well, we'll let you know. It feels like we're getting more meat now that we're past that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, there's two categories that I cover. I cover startups, and then I cover the established enterprise vendors, and I see it across both. And I see, startups trying to solve, some interesting problems. So, for instance, I wrote about a company earlier this week that kind of looks across the whole content landscape of your company, Jira tickets and Confluence documentation and Slack messages, and you can begin to ask questions about the status of projects, and it can start to pull that kind of information together. And speaking of like being more than an answer engine, the long-term vision is to be able to surface stuff automatically and say, hey, this company that you're spending 80% of your customer success resources on is like only your 12th biggest customer. So maybe you want to rethink that. So these kinds of things that humans wouldn't necessarily see unless they thought to ask. So that's a huge kind of value add if it could work, if they can make that work. So, I mean, I think those kinds of things where you begin to be more practical. So, and then, I mean, just using Salesforce as an example, they're kind of incorporating, being able to get Salesforce information from inside of Slack by asking questions. and then being able to get information about that same kind of thing. Like I've been gone for 2 weeks, catch me up on the project, in a 500-word summary, bullet point summary, and that kind of thing. Like you come back, like you don't want to read 2 weeks worth of, stuff where they were talking about their favorite sports teams and the project. I mean, it's tedious and nobody wants to do that. So being able to do that would be great. I wrote about, Ignite this morning. They're talking about like being able to look at things like, transcripts, whether they're audio or video, asking for a summary of key points, getting a transcript, getting, the key points or a summary, however you, and eventually what they're working on is being able to like search across documents, across repositories, so that, and again, they're not there yet, but that's the vision. So you could say, they work with a lot of life sciences companies. So tell me about the whole drug discovery process for drug X for the last 4 years, and you can get a history in a summarized version, and not have to read thousands of documents, because there's just a whole lot of information that gets generated in the drug discovery process. So those are a few like concrete examples. But you're seeing more and more things when you put an answer engine on top of a piece of software. You completely change the software, because instead of the human going click click click, you're just saying, I want to do X, do it for me please, and it will, and that changes the software. I saw Brian Halligan from HubSpot in April, and he was talking about how they have a report and it's like 6 clicks, and 6 clicks isn't a big deal, right? But he says, now you can just say, generate this report for me, no clicks, and that's going to make a big difference for people. I mean, it's a small amount of time, but those small amounts of time add up, and it's going to change the way we interact with our computers, in a way that's even bigger than, having a touch interface.
I'm going to pop up a question. Oh, we talk about John Reed and then he magically appears. So
Hey,
here he says, question for Ron. How do we avoid the echo chamber effect in enterprise media of all regurgitating the stories vendors think are important? How do you chase down and surface the cool, important stories that people don't? Perfect. We're thinking alike here, John. Because I was just going to ask you, who's doing stuff that's cool? I mean, who are not just feeding you the things that are shiny, but who are actually doing things you consider to be cool?
I mean, some of those things I just cited, I think, are cool in and of themselves. I mean, I think it's going to be hard for these vendors to differentiate. And it's how do you put this kind of technology on top of your technology in a way that makes sense, that, as you say, I mean, that the vendors themselves aren't following. And yeah, I mean, that's always, what you're asking is always a danger, right? But what I've tried to do is report on the news that the vendors are saying is news and judging whether it's news or not, right? And then also looking more deeply into the subject of AI in general and trying to figure out some things. Like, so for instance, I wrote a story about how maybe after seeing at a conference in April, Sam Altman was there. Well, he wasn't there. He was kind of broadcast in, but he was being interviewed, and he talked about how, basically having, the bigger and better large language models with more and more attributes might not be the be all and end all of this game. And that got me thinking, and I wrote the news story that he said that. And then I started talking to a bunch of people about, well, do we really need smaller large language models? And then, that's sort of something that's become, this was in April-ish, and that's sort of become how I think a lot of the vendors are approaching it. They're saying, if we create these models with a, kind of a restrained set of data, it's going to be more likely to give a good answer, and this will be more helpful to people in the long run than what I call boil the ocean generative AI, which is what OpenAI is doing with the public version of ChatGPT. So what we're starting to do is people are taking these foundational models like GPT-4, and they're saying, okay, I'm going to take that and I'm going to apply some stuff to it that's relevant to my company and my customers. And then I'm going to take that data that's in our systems and my customer systems, and I'm going to, create a system that's more relevant than maybe the boil the ocean kind would be. One thing we haven't talked about is some of the downsides of all this, and hallucinations being one of them, where obviously that's where the model, the large language model, gives a very confident sounding answer that's just wrong.
Like the example of the lawyer who used ChatGPT and put all this stuff in there that it came up with, including actual cases that never existed.
Right. I mean, that's bad, right? And I mean, when you're working with actual real customers to, you know, you have to make sure that So I mean, it's like somebody I spoke to. I can't remember who it is right now, but he said there are certain cases where 80% being right 80% of the time is fine, right? And I think it was actually Ray Wang, and he said, like being right 80% of the time in certain scenarios will be okay. Like if you give a wrong answer, it's like not going to be the end of the world for your customer. But there are certain cases where you have to be right all the time. Medicine, finance, bridge building. These are things like you can't be just close to the right answer. You have to get the right answer.
Right.
So it's going to depend on the scenario. But for now, hallucinations are a real problem. And from what I've been told, like even using this kind of confined form of data will reduce the problem. But you still, you're going to need humans in the loop saying, is this right? And, before you hand it off to a customer or, a client.
Yeah, and I know my buddy Michael Wu over at Pros, he talked about, well, that's a feature of this stuff. It's called generative for a reason. It
Right.
creates stuff, and some of the stuff it creates when it's for just pure creative purposes, oh, it's great.
Right, it's fiction.
But if you're putting your life in the hands of this thing for something critical, you might not want to just coming up with stuff that doesn't make any sense.
Right. I mean, and this goes back years, right? I remember when IBM had Watson Health, and they made a big push into health, and it didn't really succeed as well as they had hoped. But I remember talking to a friend of mine about it, and he's like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, hold off! I don't want machine making my medical decisions." I'm like, no, it wouldn't. it would be working with a medical professional to make those decisions. But it theoretically it could go through a body of work and find stuff that even the most knowledgeable medical professional couldn't keep up with or understand or know, because it's just too much. So I mean, over time maybe that would be good, but again, you don't want people getting lazy and saying, oh, the generative AI said to do X, so I'm going to do it. Like you have to look at it and say, this has to pass through some sort of proof stage before you share it with people or use it to make a decision.
You say you talk to so many companies.
I do.
And there's all these new ones starting up. There's a lot of capital sitting there waiting to just be thrown at companies that know how to spell Gen AI at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And of course you got the mainline huge tech companies that are all positioning. Are we going to see some kind of a huge, like they say every 10 or 15 years, like 80% of the S&P 500 switches? Are we going to see anything like any huge tech shakeups, like some company that most people never heard of before 2 or 3 years from now would be like the next Apple? Or are we just going to see the bigger companies figure out ways to either acquire or organically build muscles and keep their position?
Well, we don't know, but what we don't know, right? I mean, and there may be a company out there that's working on something right now that we don't know about. But I think for the most part, it's going to be that the big companies and the companies that you see that are creating the foundational bits of this, I don't know if that's going to change unless, there's something, beyond these models that is something that we don't know about, right? So you can never say never, but who's well positioned? Obviously the well capitalized companies that can put a ton of money into this. These are resource heavy kinds of things to generate. They take tons of compute power. They take tons of cash. And I was watching this video the other day. It was a presentation, and the woman worked for some nonprofit, and she was saying, well, we tried to do this, but then we ran out of money, and because it was so expensive to run the experiment that they wanted to run. So I mean, these things are very expensive to run, and even if you factor in that there'll be open source models that will, help in that regard, I think that the cost of the infrastructure behind these models, and again, even if they get more efficient at it, the chips get better. There are all kinds of things that are going to happen that bring down the cost, but it's a resource intensive thing. So the idea that somebody, unless they're hugely well capitalized, can come out of the woodwork and become a player here, it becomes harder and harder for that to happen. So that's to answer that question. In terms of will the S&P 500 turn over, I think that's a factor of how people embrace new technology, right? And I've looked at it this way. I wrote an article, a couple of months ago called "Is This AI's Light Bulb Moment?" And that was from a couple of ideas. One was that this was like when people saw light bulbs, and their light bulbs turned on in their house, and they didn't have to light candles anymore. It was like, wow, I get it. Electricity is great, but electricity had been around for quite a while and had been like a enabling technology for quite a while prior to the invention of the light bulb. And the light bulb was the thing that brought it home, quite literally, to individuals on the street. Like, wow, I don't have to light candles anymore. I can use this thing, and this is a life-changing moment. We've been basically living our lives in the dark, and so that was one thing. The other thing that I sort of came to my mind was I visited GE's labs in New York State in 2017, and they have these incredible experiments going on. But they had this exhibit about the onset of electricity in the late 18th and the late 19th and early 20th century, and basically there were companies. There was a debate. Do we move to electricity, this newfangled electricity, or do we stick with steam? And steam required, these factories with these huge infrastructures to run, and electricity was more efficient. And of course, electricity won, but there were companies who stubbornly adhered to not moving to electricity. And part of me thinks that, well, if you're looking at AI now, saying like, well, I don't think I need to pay attention to it. I mean, you could be a steam company.
Oh my goodness. All right, I got two last questions.
Okay.
That one got me actually.
Sorry.
So, there's all this excitement about Oppenheimer. I'm gonna set aside the Barbie stuff. There's a lot of excitement around Oppenheimer, and it made me think, is AI or GenAI, are we at the Oppenheimer moment for AI, GenAI? And I say that meaning this is the guy
we could destroy ourselves, right?
Yeah, it's good credit. Yeah, he's credited for, he put the team together. He was the leader, built the bomb, and after they built the bomb, it hit him. It's like, oh my God, what have we done? What have I done? What could happen? What's the impact over this thing that we built? Are we at that moment right now? Are we able to still make sure the potential negative, catastrophic negatives can be reined in, or are we at a point where it's out the bag now and whatever happens happens?
I don't think we're at a nuclear moment. You have people out there talking about that, that it's a existential threat to humanity. And I read an interesting article that talked about how by saying that, they're distracting people from the actual dangers that this AI in its current state can do. And it can do a lot of pretty sophisticated things. I mean, and we saw in 2016 during the election, how algorithms at that time, and bots could be put to bear on, democracy and have a huge impact on how people think and act and behave. So, I think the potential has been there all along. This kind of speeds it up. That kind of stuff we should be more worried about. Manipulation, truly fake news, people creating videos of things that didn't happen. Those are all possible now. And I think those things are worrisome, but they're not nuclear, right? They're if you look at on a spectrum of what, nuclear destruction and AI having the power to do something destructive, I don't think we're there yet. I think it's going to be more by degrees than Oppenheimer's deadly toy, to quote Sting. But we're being kind of, what John is saying, we're being kind of manipulated into looking at the most dangerous extension of where we are now, instead of looking at what this stuff can do and what we should do to kind of temper what this can do. We're a long way from, this general AI. And I know that Sam talks about it a lot, Sam Altman, and I know there are a lot of people out there talking about it. But I think we're years away from that. And again, if you go back to what Rodney Brooks said, it's like, just because you can do one thing doesn't mean you can do everything. And to get it to even do that one thing takes so much work and so much brain power. Now, as we get into more powerful computers and quantum computing and, we're probably going to start to create stuff faster. But again, I don't know. You can't necessarily extrapolate that in like X number of years, AI is going to be smarter than we are. What does that even mean, right? I mean, we're the ones who are creating it. So, and how do you define intelligence? I mean, this article went into all kinds of interesting, angles of this. But for now, I think that we're having these discussions, that governments are having these discussions, that technologists are having these discussions. And to some extent, you have to look at what OpenAI and Microsoft and Alphabet and Meta and Amazon, these big companies are saying, because to me, they're trying to just give themselves a competitive advantage. Like, if we create these rules that we know we can meet, we know that we can afford to meet, it's going to make it harder for the startups who, want to come in, because they're going to have to spend even more money and resources just to comply with these rules. So, I mean, it's very complicated. There's a political element, there's a philosophical element, there's a legal element, there's just a lot going on. But I don't know that we're anywhere close to, being at the Oppenheimer moment. And again, I say that as somebody who's not a computer scientist and as somebody who's just a humble scribe.
But a company like NVIDIA, what role do they play in all this? Because
I mean, they're amazing, right?
Yeah.
So their role is, I mean, somehow someone figured out that GPUs were a great way to run models. And, once that they went from a, kind of a game chip company to this something entirely different. And now, I mean, sooner or later, other companies are going to start producing chips. And I mean, I don't understand why Google hasn't, for instance. Like, they came up with their chips in 2013 they came up with their first AI chip. Like, why are they not out there? This is baffling to me. Like, why they aren't a player here. But they've had trouble commercializing a lot of the stuff that they do in house. And I mean, even Google Cloud, if you look at it, you're like, they run some of the most complex stuff in the world. They should be able to sell this stuff to enterprises. And not to pick on Google, but I mean, there are other companies out there that should be able to do what NVIDIA is doing eventually. I mean, certainly, Intel, AMD, they have the capacity and the resources to do it, and maybe Ampere, the newer chip companies. There's things happening, but for now, NVIDIA has created itself like this money machine with these chips, and they're a big player in it because I don't quote Elon very much, but I saw a quote where he said, "These chips are harder to get than drugs," and I think drugs are probably a lot easier to get than chips.
Yeah, but yeah, no, I find NVIDIA's company. I really started paying attention a couple years ago, and then when you started seeing the partnerships, with Adobe and ServiceNow and all these companies, particularly the ones in in the CRM industry, start a partner on creating custom chips, for specific use cases, and that to me would seem to be the ultimate kind of way to be the gatekeeper, because how many small companies can afford to work at that level to
But I mean, then
ensure
again, how many people can afford the chips? I mean, they're so expensive. I mean,
yeah.
and that's kind of, we haven't talked about the cloud vendors in all of this, but the cloud vendors are going to play a big role, because I mean, a lot of people are just going to say, like, I can't set this up myself, and they'll go to the cloud vendors for it. And I think that's what they're banking on. They're saying, well, their growth is kind of stunted right now and falling, and maybe down the road, as this starts to take off and people start experimenting more with this, it will be like a rejuvenation of the cloud business, because people are going to be spending a lot of money running models.
Well, that's why it feels like, at least right now, it feels like Microsoft and Azure has really kind of taken the mantle from AWS, particularly in this area. I could be wrong or not, but it just feels like that. It seems like there's a lot of momentum, maybe because it feels like Microsoft has so many layers that they can layer on top of Azure that kind of fit all these different puzzles, where Amazon is kind of, well, particularly the enterprise space, Amazon doesn't have the pieces that Microsoft has that sit on top of that layer.
Well, I mean, they have the software, right? I mean, they have
Yeah.
Office, and so many of such a large percentage of the world's biggest companies use that. But I mean, I don't think you can count Amazon out just because of their market clout. I don't know if you saw this morning, there was an interview with Adam Selipsky and the Financial Times, and I didn't get through the whole thing, but what I read was, I mean, the fact that he gave an interview to the Financial Times sort of tells you that maybe he feels like it's necessary to put a message out there.
Mhm.
But he did talk a little bit about, he was asked, do you feel pressure because of what Microsoft is doing and their and their agreement with OpenAI, and his position was basically that it's still so early that it's like the early days of the internet. Like, nobody knew who was going to be who was going to be the winners in 97. He said, if you even look at search in 97, the biggest vendor back then was Alta Vista, and now nobody knows who Alta Vista is except old people like us.
Yeah. Remember Lycos? Remember that one?
Yeah, Yahoo, which is still
Yeah.
around as the in brand, as the parent of my publication. But the winner wasn't determined in 97. I think he makes a point, but I think because of the size and scope of these vendors that are around today, maybe it's not quite as analogous as he's making it. But I don't think they've lost because they've of the agreement with OpenAI. I think it does give them somewhat of a head start, but I mean, I'm curious what Amazon's going to be announcing at reInvent this year, because last year was kind of quiet in terms of the big announcements, and I think they kind of need something that's going to get people to turn their heads.
And speaking of turning their heads, John is talking about being on MySpace last night. So there you go. What a way to integrate conversation with MySpace.
Am I one of your 8 friends, John?
Oh God. We've completely gotten to a time work, folks. But this has been an absolutely great conversation, as they always are with Ron. But Ron, a year from now, where do you expect to be with this stuff? What do you? I mean, I know that's kind of hard to even ask because this stuff.
I'm not good at predictions, but I will say that I think hype's got to die down. We go through these cycles with technology. Like I said, whatever it is, the technology of the moment seems like it's the only thing. This is a little bit more fundamental because it has the capacity to change things in a very, very huge way. I mean, it can, like I said, it can change the way we interact with software, the way we build software, the way we think about our computers. And, the way I've looked at this is, I read this story about Bletchley Park, which was where the code breakers were in England during World War II.
Alan Turing.
And Alan Turing created this computer, which was a room. It was this huge room, and operators, like, they would program it, and operators would have to climb inside it with alligator clips.
Well, they have punch cards.
No, before punch cards. This was like you had to set the zeros and ones with alligator clips.
Oh my gosh!
And then they would run the machine, and then no, right, and they would reset it. And I mean, this was like as manual as you can get, right? I mean, this was, if you think about, how much we've abstracted away in terms of complexity of how we work with our machines. But I think we have the potential to get beyond that. In a year, no. In a year, I think the hype will have died down.
Okay.
At least I hope so. I think that it will be a given that your company has this stuff, and it'll be more about, like, how are you taking these large language models? How are you putting them to work? And as you said, how are they helping to automate workflows, to make better decisions, to help you improve customer experience, something we've been talking about for 15 years, and it's still terrible. So theoretically, if you can take and say, okay, I'm going to build a website for, they use this example at the Salesforce event in May. They said, somebody who loves Formula One, because for some reason everybody in Silicon Valley loves Formula One. But they said, if, like, you're a really big Formula One fan and there's an event coming up in your area, and they just basically create a website on the fly, that says all this great stuff about Formula One and offers you VIP tickets and, gives you a portal into, your favorite drivers, I mean, creating an experience that really matters to you.
Right.
That would be something, right? I mean, that would be, and the whole workflow side of it, I think, is something that could be huge. The developer side of it, if we can get better at, again, getting rid of some of these mundane tasks and letting developers think at a higher level. And again, we haven't talked about this, jobs. I think it will replace some of the, if you're doing a mundane job all day, you probably hate it anyway. But, we lost a lot of the people who did mundane jobs during the pandemic because they said, life's too short to do a mundane job. And we saw that a lot of jobs are just staying open. And, and that includes, like, fast food. Like, you walk into a restaurant and it's still, to this day, it's like, there's not enough help. So the idea that, this is going to take over and, like, take our jobs, I don't necessarily think that's true. I think that it's going to create a lot more room for us to do our jobs better and to maybe help, from a business perspective, our customers in a much more direct way. And hopefully, between that and the workflow and the developer tools, that will all go to improve the whole computing experience. I don't think that's going to happen in a year, but I think that is where we're going to be moving towards, and where this technology, as it matures, will be able to kind of push us towards.
I would say that would be where it should head.
Yeah,
You
whether
know,
it does or not, that'll be the test, right?
yeah, that's true. Uh, I would suspect there's going to be some distractions along the way. And let's face it, some marketing is going to be, you know, trying to pitch to a certain way to keep that interest drummed up. I don't know how that impacts the actual, let's get the infrastructure, let's get, the things that could really be helpful. Let's get that well on the way. Let's try to stay away from too much pie in the sky. I just think it's kind of hard to do. It's unfortunate, and we John and Esma talked about that yesterday. There's a lot of stuff that's out there that distracts us from what we could and should really be focused on. Let's just hope that the tech vendors can distance themselves to a certain extent away from that, because there's some really good, like I said, there's some incredible things that can be done that could be very beneficial if we could stay focused on that, as opposed to trying to keep all the eyes on us for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it comes down to what I said, the boil the ocean approach, which is where you try to do everything for everyone, and you probably don't do anything well. And where you try to do, like you said, some pointed tasks that improve the lives of the people who are using the software, because they don't, I mean, when you look at these software systems still remain incredibly complex. They require layers and layers of people to run. And, the more that you can kind of reduce and abstract away an element of that complexity and make people's lives easier, I think that's going to be all for the better.
Yep. All right, Ron. Well, it's always all for the better talking with you,
Oh, thank you.
unless we're talking about football or something
Right.
like
Well,
that.
then we agree to disagree.
But yeah, we're gonna have to do that again. And another thing that I know both of us are really interested in. I want to know what all the impact of all these opportunities around Gen AI are on DEI, on companies that are led by people of color and women. Are they getting an opportunity to participate in this? Maybe we could do something around that, bring some folks together and talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, and just looking at DEI, because I don't know if you saw this article in the Wall Street Journal the other day that said a lot of the the diversity chief diversity officer uh, roles are being eliminated, and as soon as we hit kind of a economic speed bump, a lot of that kind of stuff was the first to go, um, and that I found very discouraging. So I think it would be useful to talk to some companies and see, what they're doing, who is being performative, and who is, actually trying to make substantive change.
Yeah, and by the way, when did we hit that economic speed bump? Because it doesn't feel like we've actually hit it based on
No,
all
there's a
the
lot, there's a lot of perception, and it sort of differs from the actual reality out there. I agree with you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks again, Ryan, for
That's a
joining.
discussion for another day, right?
Definitely for another day.
Yeah.
We'll let John get back on MySpace. Thanks for
See you on MySpace, John.
and everybody. I will see you tomorrow on CRM Players. I think we're gonna have Brian Solis. Man,
oh, that's cool.
Gonna be cool. Yeah, we haven't had him. We haven't talked to him since he's been at ServiceNow. So hopefully, if everything goes right, he'll be joining us tomorrow. So until then, we'll see you. Bye.
All right. Thanks for having me.